Chapter 1 Starting Afresh Descartes. Descartes, 1596 to 1650, was a particularly knowledgeable man, but he is more famous for what he pretended to doubt than for what he actually knew. How can I be sure that I am not dreaming? He asked. How can I be certain that some deceitful demon is not filling my head with falsehoods? In the spirit of Francis Bacon's proverb, quote, "If a man will begin with certainties, he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties." End quote. Descartes invited his reader to join him in a cold bath of skepticism, which he himself had found to be wonderfully invigorating. He wrote, "Since I now wished to devote myself solely to the search for truth, I thought it necessary to reject as if absolutely false everything in which I could imagine the least doubt. Thus, because our senses sometimes deceive us, I decided to suppose that nothing was such as they led us to imagine. And since there are men who make mistakes in reasoning, and because I judged that I was as prone to error as anyone else, I rejected as unsound all the arguments I had previously taken as demonstrative proofs. Lastly, considering that the very thoughts we have while awake may also occur while we sleep without any of them being at the time true, I resolved to pretend that all the things that had ever entered my mind were no more than the illusions of my dreams." Descartes soon found something which could not be an illusion, however, something he could know to be true even if he were dreaming. He had found his first certainty, he said. "I noticed that while I was trying thus to think everything false, it was necessary that I, who was thinking, was something, and observing that this truth, I am thinking, therefore I exist, was so firm and sure that all the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics were incapable of shaking it. I decided that I could accept it without scruple as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking." Quote, "I think, therefore I am. Ego cogito, ergo sum," as he put it in Latin, became the most famous slogan in philosophy, and is an odd sort of a first principle. It seems indubitable enough, yet also too simple to serve as the foundation for anything. How much useful information can possibly follow from it, as we shall see. Descartes' route from his own mere existence to a whole new system of knowledge was somewhat indirect, and has been widely misunderstood. But he was convinced that with "I think, therefore I am," he had found the right place to start. He was also convinced that he could virtually finish the job. For one thing that the great doubter never really questioned was his own importance. Not only were the principles he eventually arrived at so certain and evident that whoever rightly understands them will have no occasion to dispute them, they were also, he believed, sufficiently wide-ranging to provide definitive answer to all scientific questions. Descartes' grandiose ambitions even extend to a system of medicine founded on infallible demonstrations. He once said that the preservation of health had always been the principal end of my studies, and he believed he was on the verge of discovering how to prolong human life. He apparently thought that, given enough time on this earth, plus some artisans to make equipment for him, he could complete the task of science himself. He said, "I venture to say that I have found a way to satisfy myself within a short time about all the principal difficulties usually discussed in philosophy. What is more, I have noticed certain laws which God has so established in nature, and of which He has implanted such notions in our minds, that after adequate reflection we cannot doubt that they are exactly observed in everything which exists or occurs in the world." Aristotle had never expressed himself with such confidence. Perhaps the intervening centuries of faith in Christianity helped to make such self-assurance possible. After all, if the truth about religious matters can be stated definitively, how much of a problem could the truth about nature be? Descartes' familiarity with the new science of Galileo fueled his optimism. The mechanical philosophy seemed an enormous leap forward after centuries of stagnation. Surely the truth was now just around the corner. The same sense of excitement has been felt in our own time by some physicists, who expect recent advance to culminate in a final theory that will explain literally everything. In 1980, an eminent cosmologist, Stephen Hawking, wrote that this might well happen within the next 20 years. This turned out to be somewhat premature, as similar pronouncements regularly have been since the end of the 19th century. In 1894, Albert Michelson, the first American to win a Nobel Prize in Science, said that all the main laws and effects of physics had already been discovered. In 1928, Max Born, another Nobel Prize winner, said that the physics would be completed in about 6 months' time. We can now see that Descartes had less justification for his hopes than our modern optimists have for theirs, but he can hardly be blamed for not realizing this. Besides, he had a special reason for confidence in his ideas. They had walked unscathed through the valley of deepest doubt, and were also the first to be put to the grueling test. How, then, could they fail to be correct? Descartes was in a position to speak with authority about the new science, for he was one of its principal authors. Modern applied mathematics is largely based on an invention of his, namely analytic geometry, which uses algebra to solve practical problems about space and motion. He did more than anyone else of his day to illustrate how mathematics could be put to work throughout the sciences. Galileo and Kepler were the pioneers in this subject, but their efforts were fragmentary ones. Descartes' work was more comprehensive. He labored to construct a unified account of nature that would be as all-encompassing as Aristotle's, but based on an Aristotelian mechanical principle that the physical phenomena are to be explained in terms of a contact between moving bodies and the motions and shapes of their parts. In physics and cosmology, Descartes propounded theories which were for a time serious rivals to those of Isaac Newton. and which stimulated some of Newton's ideas. A few years after Newton's death, Voltaire, 1694 to 1778, wrote, quote, "I don't think we really dare compare in any way Descartes' philosophy with that of Newton. The first is a sketch, the second is a masterpiece." End quote. Nevertheless, Voltaire continued, quote, "The man who set us on the road to truth is perhaps as noteworthy as the one who since then has been to the end of the road." End quote. Most of Descartes' scientific work, except for his mathematics, has been superseded, which is partly why he is now remembered as an abstract thinker rather than as a man of science. This tends to be obscure the fact that much of his life was spent not in ruminating about the topics of what he called first philosophy or metaphysics, the nature of the soul, the limits of knowledge, and the existence of a God, for example, but rather in experiments, dissections, observations, and calculations. Despite Descartes' current reputation, the man himself seems to have been less interested in metaphysics than in applying algebra to geometry and delving into the inners of chaos. While living in Amsterdam in around 1630, he visited the butchers' shops every day to fetch carcasses for dissection. His explanation of the rainbow was a landmark in experimental science, and it was almost right. He independently discovered and was the first to publish the law of refraction, known in English-speaking countries as Snell's law, which explains why a straight stick can appear bent when partly immersed in water. He also conducted research in physiology, medicine, meteorology, geology, and all the other mysteries that the mechanical philosophy promised to illuminate. It was Descartes who first demonstrated in detail that the workings of human bodies could be studied as if they were machines. He seized on William Harvey's discovery of the circulation of the blood and generalized such ideas to develop a comprehensively mechanistic physiology. He also, however, made several incorrect criticisms of Harvey and misdescribed the function of the heart. Descartes was so fascinated by machines and all kinds of mechanical contraptions that, according to a piece of widespread gossip, he was often accompanied by a life-sized working doll that was practically indistinguishable from his illegitimate daughter, Francine. This tale, with its suggestions of infernal cleverness and of madness bordering on impropriety, became current in the latter half of the 18th century, when extreme versions of materialism and even atheism were defended by some radicals in France. Descartes' mechanistic science and his rationalist worldview were by this time widely seen as having sown the seeds of these ghostly aftergrowths, much though Descartes himself would have abhorred them. He did not maintain that the people were machines, as some others later did, only that the people's bodies were machines. And he was apparently untouched by any doubts about the main dogmas of the Catholic Church.